Welcome to Museum Archipelago. I'm Ian Elsner. Museum Archipelago is your audio guide through the landscape of museums. Each episode is never longer than 15 minutes, so let's get started.
My name is Dr. Porchia Moore. I live in Columbia, South Carolina, and I currently work in a brand new position at the Columbia Museum of Art as the Inclusion Catalyst. I also am a regular contributing writer for the Incluseum, and I also co-create a project called The Visitors of Color with Nikhil Trivedi. I'm technically a librarian who studies museums. My PhD is in library information science with a specific focus on cultural heritage informatics. In my early sort of days in my program, when I knew that I really wanted to specifically look at issues of engagement and participation and looking at legacies of exclusion and looking at, in particular, communities of color and communities who have been very much largely neglected in terms of like the museum visitor, one of the things that I did early on was to do a sort of pilot survey with class in one of our local historically black colleges. I gave a survey to about 24 students. The responses that I got from that survey were just so devastating. What essentially people shared was that in spite of the fact that there were at least 3 museums within less than a 20-mile radius, that they had not, and these were freshmen in college, that they had not actually been to a museum since they were between middle school and in some cases early as elementary school. And they also had not gone with family members, and they were not aware at all that there were any museums so close to them geographically. When I asked them very specific questions like, if you do enjoy museum going, or if you have recently visited a museum within the last 2 or 3 years, what can you tell me about museums? And some of the responses, things like museums are there to tell us about slavery, or museums are there to tell us about sad times. So it was already, for me, it had me thinking about the ways in which we, first of all, tell stories and the stories that we tell. And a lot of the students literally said that they usually don't attend museums because they don't want to know any more about slavery. They feel like the narrative is overdone, that they can't learn anything else outside of it. I still to this day can't make the connection between the idea of a museum, specifically when we talk about different types of museums, and how does that idea of a museum automatically equate to slavery or institutions of oppression or traumatic instances in history. And that was already like a barrier or disconnect to wanting to engage with museums as a whole, regardless of the genre.
Visitors of Color is a Tumblr project that documents the perspectives and experiences of marginalized people in museums. It is a record of what the museum experience can be like for groups which are often discussed, but whose voices are rarely privileged, groups that don't feel welcome in museums, and groups that don't feel like nearby museum spaces are for them. The Visitors of Color project was catalyzed by a panel discussion Dr. Moore was part of at the Museum Computer Network conference.
In 2015, when the conference was being held in Minneapolis, myself and Adrian Russell of Museums Respond to Ferguson and Cabinet of Curiosities, we gave a panel discussion at MCN. It was standing room only. We had a ton of folks attend, and we really started to delve into the topic of race and racism, equity and inclusion within museums. What does that really look like? How does that really impact everything from the visitor to the front house folks at museums to, all different types of staff. And it was a very sort of challenging, really amazing conversation, lots of dialogue, lots of great conversation from the room, lots of really hard questions. It was a very, very sort of difficult conversation, but I also was really happy that we had that conversation. And after that session, I think a lot of things sort of shifted both in the room and at the conference. And Nikhil sort of approached me and said, hey, I've been thinking about this idea of creating a project where we really kind of focus on the actual visitor, and in particular the visitor of color and or marginalized voices. And it was really cool because I had been thinking about a very similar project and had talked with Alicia and Rose of the Incluseum about how I could really kind of do this project, what would it look like, where would I put it. And it was so very much similar to Nikhil's project that I was like, for me, it felt like a very sort of divine moment there in Minneapolis at MCN. And that actually was where the Visitors of Color project launched. And we really wanted to make sure that we embedded a lot of the conversation and the topics that came up from the dialogue that Adrian and I had that day about race and racism and inclusion and equity. So I think I say all that to say, for me, this project is also another way for us to just talk about the importance for new points of reference in museum work in terms of like exhibitions and label writing and programs and events. Because I think what I feel like I untapped just a little bit in the early survey that I did of several years ago was that there is this idea that museums are places that have these old, haunting, traumatic stories that have no real relevance in people's everyday lives. From the beginning, both Nikhil and I we've been approaching colleagues, friends of friends, trying to go out into the community and find people that we think might be willing to contribute their stories. And what we very quickly realized, though, is that people had a lot of stories, and in fact, some of the stories were triggering and traumatizing. Some of them were very powerful and insightful, but we also, I think, at least I did not in the beginning, I wasn't fully aware of the amount of time that it would take to actually get those stories from folks, to be able to sort of gather and collect those stories and to be able to mine like really rich jewels from our conversations. And so we really view it as a sort of counter-narrative project. I'm also someone who is a critical race theorist, and so the idea of a counter-narrative is very, very important to me. I think a counter-narrative helps to sort of decenter whiteness and to decenter our notions of what I think, or like to call the master narrative, like the sort of known way that things happen. And so all of our sort of interviews actually really take a good bit of time. And then also I think sometimes with some of our questions, people are sort of like, why do you want to know about my experiences in museums? And so it's been very interesting, like I said, to be able to gather the stories, but also that level of trust that you get when people share those stories. And also it kind of helps us to just, I think, really, again, be deeply connected to our own individual work within museums. And I think it reinforces the power of the work that we're trying to do, but also the power of museums as cultural heritage institutions within our communities. The folks that I have interviewed have often, first and foremost, have said thank you. But they've also shared sort of stories about after having shared the information about their museum going. I think we've had conversations about, well, what is a museum? What does it mean for me to be connected to a museum? By and large, people are very proud of the project. I think they're very proud to be a part of the project. And I think for me, at least that makes me feel really good about what it is that we're trying to do. Ironically enough, I actually don't really hear from people who've been a part of the project as much as I think Nikhil and I both hear from educators from around the country. People email us about the project. People tweet us about the project. I've heard from so many institutions across the country will actually use some of the images and the words in some of their training. I know that there are institutions across the country who are using the language in the project in their syllabi and in their museum studies courses. And I think sometimes that is just very mind-blowing, and it's a very humbling experience to know that so many people are being impacted by it. And also, I think in terms of like visitor studies, I think it's definitely having an impact on the types of questions and the frameworks that museum visitor studies folks are asking and thinking about. So in my mind, I think that's the greatest sort of byproduct of the project itself.
As Dr. Moore has written before, the experiences presented on Visitors of Color aren't outliers. If they were, then there wouldn't be such a response. You can read Visitors of Color at visitorsofcolor.tumblr.com. This has been Museum Archipelago. We hope you enjoyed your visit. For more information or to submit feedback, go to museumarchipelago.com or museum_go on Twitter. Next time, bring a friend.